Being able to update, modify, and change your data source settings for individual connections is great to understand and extremely valuable. But what if you had, say, like a database connection that contained multiple schemas, like one for development, test, user acceptance, and production? And you wanted to easily toggle back and forth between the different schemas without updating each table connection or path individually. Or better yet, what if you developed a report and wanted to allow other team members to dynamically change the database schemas? Well, that's where dynamic data source parameters come into play, because they allow you to dynamically manage and update connection paths within the query editor. And parameters can be found within the Home tab, just to the left of the data source settings, and they allow you to do things like manage, edit, and create new parameters. So to get started, you'll need to create a new parameter or parameters based on your connection. And in this example, I've created two new parameters, one for the MySQL Server connection and another for the database schemas. Here, I'm using generic names like database and then specifying that it's part of the Maven fuzzy factory. Just good kind of data hygiene here and making sure that you're naming things clearly and appropriately. Our next input here that we need to set up is the parameter input type. And this can be set to something like any value or text or date, decimal number, etc. There's a bunch of different options here for the types. After that is set, the suggested value option can then be configured. The default setting here is for any value, but you can also create a list of values, like we're showing here, or create a query. Now, creating a list of values is a pretty powerful way to easily switch between different databases, and it really only requires a little bit of setup, which again, I'll be walking through in much more detail shortly. Now, the last pieces of the parameter to configure are the default and current value settings. And when you're setting these up, pay attention to any sort of business logic or rules and, make sure that you're adhering to your organization's best practices. And depending on the suggested value you choose, you may or may not have both of these options available. So for example, you may only have the ability to set a current value. But the idea here is that you can set the same or different values. So once the parameter is configured, we need to update the data source connection credentials from a text-based field to the parameter that we created. And then after that, we'll be able to check the M code of our query connections and see that it's updated. So let's head over to Power BI and I'll walk you through this. All right, so for this demo, we're going to be continuing to use that Maven fuzzy factory data set, all right, that's up here in all of our demo queries. And just to make you aware, I've actually amended this a little bit. And let me jump over quickly to the MySQL Workbench view so you can see that I've got two different schemas set up here. All right, so we're in MySQL Workbench, and you can see that we have one schema for development with all our tables and another one for production. So we've got both of these environments set up. Let's head back to Power BI and we'll start working through getting these parameters configured. All right, so what we want to do is add a parameter to the source step here, right? So it dynamically updates, right? And if I click into the source step here and click the expand button for the M code here for the formula bar, you can see that we have our MySQL database connection, right? And the server is set as text. And then our schema is also set as text here. But these values are hard coded in. So what we don't want to do is go through and manually update these for each of these connections. We want to do this more dynamically, right? So what we need to do is head into the data source options here. And we want to parameterize both of these, the server and the database name. But if you remember back to the slides, we had this little box to the left here. We don't have that right now. So what we need to do is actually enable something else within the query editor. So if we head up to our view menu and you have this option here for parameters that says always allow. So when I click that, if I head back to the source step, we now have this drop down where we can choose a text-based value, a parameter, or we can actually create a new parameter directly from here. So this is awesome. What we want to do is create parameters for the entire MySQL connection, not at the individual table level. So let's get out of this dialog box and we'll head back to our home menu. And then from manage parameters, we want to create a new parameter that we can then apply to our entire MySQL connection. All right, so Manage Parameters dialog box opened up, and you can see here that we already have an existing parameter here. Right, that parameter was actually created as part of this transform file from sales data, so we're not going to mess with that. If we were to edit any of this, it would mess up that connection. So we're going to continue to work with this parameter 2 here. And just like in the slides, we're going to choose a new name. So this is going to be server. And then I'm going to name this fuzzy factory. Again, just so we have a better idea of what it's for. Type, you can see that we have a bunch of different types here. So we could allow for any, decimal, date, time, whatever. We'll choose this as text. Suggested values, we can choose any value, a list of values. We can create a query here. Because we're connecting to a single database, I'm not going to choose or create a list here, but if you had multiple different database connections that you needed to connect to, you could create a list here as well. So we'll do our 127.0.0.1 for my local machine. So what that does is that creates this brand new parameter and it adds it to our list of queries. Now, again, we can follow some organization stuff. I'm going to drag this up into our demo queries, and you can see that we have this parameter here with a current value. What's great is that if we ever wanted to update or change this, just click on Manage Parameter, and this brings you back into that parameter dialog box. Right, so you can update, adjust, or configure any new settings that you need to. So now that we've got this first parameter set up, I want to start updating these queries. So if I come up to my data source settings, just like we did in the last lecture, and I select my MySQL connection and then change source, I can now update my server from this text value to the parameter that we just created. Right, so we can see that we have our server for fuzzy factory. For the database, if I were to choose parameter, because we haven't created a specific database parameter yet, all I have available is the fuzzy factory one, right? So what I can actually do right from this window is create a new parameter, and that's going to bring me back to this Manage Parameters dialog. So we'll create a new name here for database, and then fuzzy factory. Type, I'm going to choose this one as text. And then instead of any value here, I want to actually create a list of values. And this list of values is going to be based on the different schema names that are within my MySQL database. So we have Maven, fuzzy factory, underscore development. We'll add another record here. And then Maven, fuzzy factory, underscore production. Right, so these are the two values that I want to be able to switch between. And then like I was mentioning at the beginning of this lecture, the default and current values, again, make sure that these are set in a appropriate way that aligns with either the business logic or rules or your organization's best practices. So here, I'm going to set both of these to development, and we'll click OK. Now when we click into this database option, we can see we have both server and the database option. So that's great. I'm going to click OK here and then close. Again, we'll follow our organization best practices and drag that query in there. So now when I head into one of my individual queries and I click into my source step, look what happened. Instead of having that hard-coded server string and the database string, I now have my parameters, right? My server and my database parameter. And if I go to each one of these queries, it's the same thing. All of these have been dynamically updated with the server and database parameters instead of hard coding in those values. So this is awesome. Now, the real power of this is also being able to change between those development and production or, test environments. So what you can do is come down here to the database, and you see for the current value here, we actually have a drop-down list. And it's currently selected on development. If we update to production, this is actually throwing an error for us, right? What I was expecting to happen was that this updates to the production database. But let's go dig into this error. So what the query editor is telling us here is that it is still looking for the Maven fuzzy factory development schema in this navigation step. And you see when we come up here, this is still hard coded in. So again, we can quickly kind of go through and replace this value with our parameter value. So I'm going to come back up to my source step here, and I am going to select everything from the pound or the hash, copy that value, come back to the navigation step, and then from here, I'm going to replace everything after the schema equals sign and enter, right? And that updates our table. So I'm going to go through each one of these steps and quickly update this. And again, one of the things, if you're ever doing this, or if you're able to follow along with this demo at all, is make sure that you don't delete an extra comma. That'll throw some errors there, and it may be kind of nondescript, or you might not be quite sure what you're doing. So just be careful when you're kind of editing the M code in the query editor. Like we talked about, it's case sensitive. And again, all of the commas and parentheses and all that stuff really are critical to making sure that the code runs appropriately. All right, so we've got 2 more here. And then last one. So there we go. We've successfully updated all of the navigation steps for these schemas. And now when we go into our database schema and update this from production to development, we don't see those same errors there, right? So this is great. Nothing breaks. All right, so let's take this one step further, and I'd like to further prove to you how easy it is to change between these 2 different schemas. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to enable load for all of these tables. And once this is all set, we're going to actually load these tables into the data model. So we'll click close and apply here in a moment. Right? And Power BI is working through adding all of those Maven Fuzzy Factory tables into the front end here, into our data model. Right? And pay attention here. Right? We've got Maven Fuzzy Factory _ development. Right? And we can see that for all of these tables that are being loaded, they're coming from that development schema. And then, like we've seen with all of our other tables, they pop up over here on the right-hand side within the data view. Same thing here within the report view, right? We've got all of our different tables here. So what we can actually do is from the transform data menu, so far we've only used this menu to go back and forth between the query editor and the front end of Power BI. But we have some other options here, right? So if we click transform data, that's going to bring us right into the query editor. We can also access our data source settings and edit parameters or variables if we had them configured. So let's click on edit parameters here, and you can see that our database is set to the development. If we change this to production and then apply those changes, all right, watch what happens here. Maven Fuzzy Factory _ production, right? So Power BI is going through and it's reloading all of the table data, but it's swapping that schema from development to production. And because both of those schemas are set up the same, any sort of visuals or measures or anything that you had created that are based on those tables would automatically update. So again, just super, super powerful stuff. And it really makes things easy to be able to change between different environments very quickly. All right, so I'm going to keep these parameters configured, but I'm going to disable the MySQL queries from loading so they don't needlessly clutter up the data model. And with that, that's your crash course on creating and using data source parameters in Power BI.